Let's live on. Let's give help.
Assault and capture of the enemy. Special Operations Forces have released impressive footage of a combat operation near Pokrovsk. Everything happening right now on the front line will soon be featured in our military review. A successful hunt by Magyar's birds. Drones from the Unmanned Systems Forces attacked a bromine plant in the city of Krasnoperekopsk in northern occupied Crimea. We'll tell you what it was producing for the occupiers and where else Ukrainian kamikaze drones have struck. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the participants in the Geneva talks have made tremendous progress and have prepared an updated and refined plan to end the war. How will the Kremlin respond to it now? There's no money, but you hang in there. Putin no longer has the means to pay for cannon fodder for the war in Ukraine. Russian regions are one after another halting payments to the so-called participants of the special military operation. The Kremlin is frantically searching for a way out through new levies. What awaits the population of the Russian Federation in the near future? We'll discuss all this and more in detail right now, but first, give this episode a like and let's get started. President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced a comprehensive report by the Ukrainian delegation on the negotiations in Geneva regarding the plan to end the war. According to him, the outcomes of these reports will determine the next steps and the timeline for coordinated actions with allies. And as Alexander Bevs, advisor to the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, has already stated, as a result of negotiations between Ukrainian and American officials in Geneva, the peace plan was modified. Some points were removed from it. The 28-point plan, as everyone saw it, no longer exists. Some points were taken out, others were changed. Not a single comment from the Ukrainian side went unanswered, the advisor to the head of the Office of the President said. All the details of the Geneva negotiations are in the report by our journalists.
The US and Ukraine have published a joint statement on the peace plan. Following closed-door negotiations in Geneva, the countries announced that they had agreed on an updated framework document. The statement notes that the discussions between the American and Ukrainian delegations regarding the US peace proposal were constructive, in-depth, and marked by mutual respect.
Both sides confirmed that any future agreement must respect Ukraine's sovereignty and ensure a lasting and just peace. The final decisions on this framework document will be made by the presidents of Ukraine and the United States.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the participants in the Geneva talks have made tremendous progress. He added that he has already discussed the results of the negotiations with Trump. Rubio thinks he is satisfied. The Secretary of State also said that the U.S. understands the red lines of both sides and that Russia has yet to express its position on the plan.
It is still too early to announce the results of the negotiations on Ukraine. They are ongoing. I think today was the most productive day we've had on this issue in a very long time.
President Zelensky, following the report from the Ukrainian delegation after the first round of negotiations in Geneva, said,
"It is important that there is a dialogue with the Americans, and there are signs that President Trump's team is listening to us."
Volodymyr Zelensky will travel to the United States this week to discuss the peace plan with Trump, Reuters reports. According to the publication's sources, they will discuss the most sensitive issues of the peace plan, such as the territorial question. 2 peace documents were brought to Kyiv. According to media reports, an American delegation led by U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll visited Kyiv on November 19th to discuss 2 projects. Among them is a peace plan consisting of 28 points, which have already been published by Axios. This is not a final document, but rather a framework material for negotiations between the U.S. and Ukraine, which took place on November 21st in Switzerland. The second document, titled Framework Agreement on Security Guarantees for Ukraine, is modeled on the principles of NATO's Article 5. The draft contains 3 points. The first point provides for the use by the United States of armed forces, intelligence and logistical support, economic and diplomatic actions, and other measures in the event of renewed armed aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. The second point states that NATO members, together with France, Britain, Germany, Poland, and Finland, commit to act in coordination with the United States. The third point stipulates that the agreement will be in effect for 10 years, with the possibility of extension. At the same time, the Reuters agency published another version of the EU's peace plan for Ukraine in response to Trump's proposal. According to Reuters, the peace plan provides for limiting the number of armed forces to 800,000. The nuclear power plants will be restarted under the supervision of the IAEA, and the energy produced will be divided equally between Ukraine and Russia. NATO agrees not to station its troops in Ukraine on a permanent basis during peacetime, and Ukraine will not attempt to regain control over the occupied territories by force. Notably, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated to journalists in Geneva that he had not seen any European counterproposal.
German Chancellor Friedrich Merz assessed the prospects for ending the war in Ukraine after the talks in Geneva, stating that peace will not come overnight. Merz stated that although some issues were clarified during the negotiations in Geneva, the path to ending the war remains a long one. According to him, we also know that peace in Ukraine will not come overnight. The German Chancellor made it clear that Europe must be consulted, and that any peace plan for Ukraine must be agreed upon, taking into account its consequences for European security. Merz also called on Russia to come to the negotiating table and take a more active part in the process of finding a diplomatic solution. Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdoğan also called on Putin for peace. The day before, he had a phone conversation with the Russian dictator. After that, the Kremlin released a statement saying that Trump's plan for Ukraine could serve as the basis for a final peace settlement. Earlier, the Turkish leader stated that he would talk with Putin about ways to achieve peace in Ukraine and about resuming the grain corridor. Turkey remains committed to Ukraine's territorial integrity and supports the Crimean Tatars as a historical and cultural bridge between Ukraine and Turkey.
Turkey has reaffirmed its support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. This was stated by President Recep Erdoğan during a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
We once again reaffirmed our commitment to the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of our strategic partner, Ukraine. In this context, I would also like to emphasize our support for the Crimean Tatars, who serve as a historical and cultural bridge between Ukraine and Turkey.
Erdoğan stated that Ukraine and Turkey will continue to strengthen their cooperation in the field of trade.
Despite all the difficulties of war, we aim to increase the volume of trade to $10 billion.
The president of Turkey added that his country is ready to join in the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war.
We want to contribute to the reconstruction of Ukraine with the support of Turkish entrepreneurs who, despite difficult circumstances, do not leave the country and continue their activities in Ukraine.
The Turkish leader noted that his country is always ready to discuss with the Russian Federation any proposals that would pave the way for a just peace in Ukraine. More than 600 Russian tourists have been stranded on a cruise ship near Istanbul. On board the liner were residents of Krasnodar Krai, Moscow, and Leningrad regions. All of them had purchased a 2-week cruise costing about $3,000. This situation occurred against the backdrop of Russians refusing entry to a Turkish ferry at the port of Sochi several weeks earlier.
We are on the Trabzon-Sochi ferry. We arrived at the port of Sochi on the 6th, on November 6th at 9 a.m., and for 3 days we've been out at sea. We are staying in one place, and there is no information at all.
The ferry was never allowed to dock and it was forced to return to Turkey. At the time, the governor of Krasnodar Krai, Benyamin Kondratyev, explained the refusal by claiming that the port and city infrastructure of Sochi was supposedly unprepared to receive such vessels. The border directorate of the FSB, the FSO, and the Sochi customs authorities stated that launching a ferry service between Russia and Turkey is technically impossible under current conditions. As for the cruise liner with Russian citizens on board, the port of Istanbul, where the liner was supposed to dock, stated, and I quote, "We have no information, we cannot comment on anything." One Russian telegram channel lamented that this was supposedly Turkey's response to the actions of the Russian authorities. Meanwhile, it became known that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan had a phone conversation with the dictator of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. Earlier, the Turkish leader stated that he would speak with Putin about ways to achieve peace in Ukraine, including the resumption of the grain corridor. Commenting on Russia's war against Ukraine, Erdoğan stated that he is ready to make every possible effort on the path to peace. He emphasized that a full mobilization of efforts has been declared and expressed hope for achieving success.
In the Pokrovsk direction, Special Operations Forces carried out a successful raid, destroyed and captured occupiers, and also evacuated wounded soldiers from an adjacent unit. Taking advantage of favorable weather conditions, our fighters entered the combat zone and eliminated 2 enemy soldiers. Another one decided to surrender. The prisoner was given medical assistance and evacuated. Thanks to the successful actions of our soldiers, the position of the adjacent unit was unblocked. Thus, 3 wounded infantrymen were evacuated with the help of a ground drone, which is now regularly used by SOF operators during missions. This was added by the Special Operations Forces. And now, more details about the situation at the front. As of November 24th, over the course of the day, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine recorded 191 combat engagements with Russian invaders. The largest number of assaults, 62, were repelled by Ukrainian defenders in the Pokrovsk direction. Russia is applying pressure in 12 directions. The enemy carried out 52 airstrikes and dropped 129 guided bombs. In addition, he carried out approximately 6,000 attacks using sanctions, kamikaze drones. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, since the beginning of the full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia has lost almost 1.2 million military personnel, including 1,190 in the last 24 hours alone.
The investigative committee has cleared the center of Pokrovsk. Russian troops are unable to gain a foothold there, the 7th Airborne Assault Corps reports. According to the soldiers, Ukrainian positions remain in the city center and firefights are ongoing. The clearing operation took place in the area of the railway station, the Pokrovsk Pedagogical College and Soborny Square. This made it possible to block Russian attempts to increase pressure on the northern part of the city and to amass forces. The Ukrainian armed forces also managed to strike 5 important enemy positions in the Donetsk region. This was reported in a statement by the Special Operations Forces on Telegram. It is reported that SOF units using medium-range drones carried out a series of strikes against Russian forces advancing toward the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. In the city of Pokrovsk itself, an important enemy position was destroyed, which had provided the Russian army with a significant tactical advantage on the battlefield. According to the statement, enemy snipers used an elevated position at an industrial facility to keep a large area under fire control. In the village of Shakov, a gathering point for Russian army assault groups was discovered and destroyed. At the time of the strike, personnel from the 336 separate Guards Marine Brigade were inside the building, the Special Operations Forces noted. In the Pokrovsk district, a temporary deployment point and ammunition depot belonging to the strike UAV crew of the 6th Guards Tank Regiment of the 90th Guards Tank Division of the Russian Armed Forces was hit. In addition, an enemy ammunition depot was destroyed in the city of Dokuchaevsk. The facility was used by the Russian army as a storage and distribution point for military supplies for the group of troops advancing on Pokrovsk. Additionally, in the village of Rybinsky, the location of the logistics support unit of the occupying Vostok troop group was successfully struck. At the same time, the monitoring project Deep State reports that Russian invaders have managed to advance within the city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. According to their data, Russian occupiers succeeded in advancing south of Mirnohrad in the Pokrovsk district. However, due to the Russians' inability to break through the Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk, they are attempting to bypass the city. In the Zaporizhzhia region, the 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade successfully repelled a Russian mechanized assault in the direction of Mala Tokmachka. According to the General Staff's report, over the past day, the defense forces stopped 191 engagements. According to the agency, the enemy carried out 52 airstrikes and dropped 129 guided aerial bombs. In the north, Slobodansky and Kursk directions, our soldiers repelled 9 attacks by the occupiers over the past day. The enemy carried out 5 airstrikes using 9 guided aerial bombs and conducted 138 shellings. In the south Slobodansky direction, the enemy tried 5 times to break through the defensive lines of our defenders in the areas of the settlements of Volchansk-Sinelnikovo. In the Gulyaipol direction, Ukrainian defenders repelled 17 attacks by the occupiers near the settlements of Zeleny Gai, Zatishye, Visokoye, and towards the settlement of Priluki. In the Orekov direction, our defenders repelled 6 enemy attacks in the areas of the settlements of Stepnoye, Stepnogorsk, and Primorskoye.
Drones from the unmanned systems forces struck the Perekop bromine plant in the city of Krasnoperekopsk. This is in the north of Crimea, which is occupied by the Russians. The video of the attack was published by the commander of the unmanned systems forces, Robert Madyar Brovdi, on his social media accounts. Along with the plant, the Krasnoperekopsk main substation was also attacked, which is considered one of the key energy hubs in Crimea's power supply system. And the Brom plant is one of the largest industrial enterprises in northern Crimea, the only producer of bromine-containing chemical compounds in Eastern Europe. The commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Unmanned Systems Forces also pointed out the high military significance of the plant for the occupiers' military-industrial complex. Russia has already overheated its printing press in attempts to cover the budget deficit. The country's financial authorities have begun using monetary emission by the central bank to finance the deficit, which this year will amount to almost 6 trillion rubles. This is evidenced by an analysis from the Gaidar Institute. This year, the hole in the treasury is being almost entirely covered by the issuance of government debt, federal loan bonds, which the Ministry of Finance places every week. In the third quarter alone, for example, it placed more than 1.5 trillion rubles worth of such securities. At the start of this year, the Russian authorities had budgeted for just over 1 trillion rubles in deficit, but were forced to increase their estimate by almost 5 times after oil and gas revenues plummeted by 20% and the non-resource tax plan was completely missed. Meanwhile, in the Russian regions, as a result, funds to finance the supply of new contract soldiers for the aggressor country's army are already running out rapidly. The Kremlin is frantically searching for a way out through new levies. So, what awaits the population of the Russian Federation in the near future? We'll tell you right now. And please don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Putin is running out of money for the war. US sanctions have hit Lukoil and Rosneft hard, and their effects have now reached even the most remote regions. Russian regions have started to run out of funds for contract soldiers for the war in Ukraine. In Yakutia, due to a budget deficit, payments to so-called participants of the special military operation have been suspended. To increase the flow of cannon fodder to the war, just a few months ago, the region significantly raised the amounts paid to contract soldiers. In June 2025, the governor of Yakutia, Aysen Nikolayev, signed a document that increased the payment from the Yakutia budget to almost 2 million rubles. In addition, municipal districts and urban okrugs committed to paying servicemen at least an additional 400,000 rubles. In addition to regional payments, contract soldiers are also entitled to 400,000 rubles from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Thus, the total amount of one-time payments can reach almost 3 million rubles. But as it turned out, there is no money for the promised mountains of gold. Another unpleasant surprise awaits Russians at the beginning of 2026. Economists are advising citizens of the aggressor country to prepare for an inflation shock due to tax increases. Despite the fact that Putin repeatedly promised not to raise taxes until 2030, the dictator's expansionist ambitions turned out to be stronger than his empty promises. And now the Russian budget will raise the VAT rate from 20% to 22%, which will put Russia among the top countries in the world in terms of this tax. At the same time, the government is launching a radical tax reform for small businesses, lowering the threshold for the simplified tax system to 20 million rubles in annual income. In addition, starting from September next year, a technology levy will come into effect in Russia, a tax that will be embedded in the price of equipment and electronics, including smartphones and laptops. A surge in prices for electronics, consumer goods, services, and fuel awaits Russians just in time for the new year. In the Kremlin, to sweeten the tax bill, they are preparing an entire propaganda campaign. The Financial Times reports that Putin has held a series of meetings on how to shift the blame for rising taxes in Russia onto the West. While the Kremlin looks for scapegoats, Russian oil is drifting at sea. The American sanctions that have come into effect have led buyers to refuse shipments of Russian oil due to the risk of falling under secondary sanctions, leaving tankers stranded at sea. We're talking about roughly 50 tankers carrying oil from Lukoil and Rosneft that, according to Bloomberg, were en route or had begun loading fuel as of Friday. However, nothing like this has happened in Russia for 8 years. The share of Russians with savings has fallen to its lowest level since 2017. Now, almost 70% of Russians have no financial safety net in case they lose their main source of income. This points to a continued deterioration of the economic climate in Russia. These are the findings of a survey conducted by the Public Opinion Foundation. But for the head of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, neither war nor crisis in Russia is a cause for concern. Despite the stagnating economy, the Chechen leader is actively building an elite district named after Putin in Grozny.